The, the topic which was chosen, namely that of magic and occultism in relationship to the secret doctrine, requires first of all a certain contextual understanding. And in this case, or at least first, the context that we wish to establish is the one into which the corpus of the secret doctrine might be considered to fit. This issue that on the centenary of the secret doctrine, we might wish to place that work into a certain larger context within which it might represent a meaningful contribution within a larger picture, I think is of considerable importance. We need to take a look now in the first portion of our discussion at the secret doctrine itself, and by implication at the larger context within which it exists and of which it forms a part. The first thesis, I would say, which I would like to establish or to suggest, is that the secret doctrine is obviously not an isolated phenomenon. It is part of a larger whole. When organizing these notes, I just started out writing out one metaphor after the other for that, and I will mention them to you. Perhaps one of them at least will strike a responsive chord. That the secret doctrine is a part of a puzzle. It is a portion of a mandala. It is a jewel, but it is a jewel in a setting which in turn is part of a larger set of jewelry. Finally, or almost finally, that it is not a shooting star on the spiritual heavens, but that it is a luminary that forms a part of a larger constellation. I imagine that's enough metaphors for just right now. If we don't get the point by way of all of these, then we never will. But the entire issue of a contextual understanding of important phenomena in life and in culture is one which is of extreme importance in our days and in our world, because especially in this culture and in this country there seems to be so little of it. And as a consequence of that, our lives, intellectual, physical, artistic and otherwise, tend to be very episodic. And the episodes are not really connected with each other. And the result of that is, of course, that we seldom are able to derive a kind of vital, transformative, psychological meaning out of life, because the total picture never seems to emerge into view, one episode merely being replaced by another. And it is for this reason that what I like to call contextual understanding must be cultivated. Of course, every approach to reality has its pitfalls. Every potentially liberating and informative and inspiring modality and device can turn into a counterproductive condition. The very instruments which can work for our spiritual liberation and transformation can become our prisons. The only one who has something to say about which of these two conditions will prevail in the long run is ourselves. And so certainly there is such a thing as being caught by the context. The greater image, the greater mandala can also become, well, something like the web of the spider. In fact, the web of a spider looks very much like a mandala. The trouble about that kind of a mandala is precisely that there is a spider in it. And as people who are devotees of Professor Tolkien, as I am, know, the large spiders, sometimes called atacops in The Lord of the Rings, are pretty perilous creatures. So there is the old fat spider spinning in a tree, and he is there to catch us in that large web. This is certainly true of any large context. But at the same time, there is also a terrible danger to the kind of disconnected episodic approach that we so often find. So at this particular time, I think we shall try to take a look at the context. But the context is a system, and the system is a potentially perilous spider web. So even the particular little schema, a little systematization that I shall outline now and engage in ought not to be taken literally. This is a suggestive construct whereby the context of esoterica may be placed so that we may derive a greater degree of meaning from it. And that principle incidentally can be applied to many, many other things. I think I had this problem with theosophical discussions all my life, since so much of it was spent in theosophy, that I shudder at the constantly reoccurring phenomenon that people represent the various statements of theosophy as facts. Facts, as Emily pointed out, and as is implicit in that delightful little quip of Krishnamurti that appeared on the video, yeah, something can be a fact and yet not be true. Then there are a lot of other things that can be true and not be facts, and we have to be careful. We have to be careful with attempts to excessively materialize and to render too concrete the subtle attempts which are like the Zen statement has its fingers pointing toward the moon. And they are all over the Secret Doctrine. It is not a description of facts, but it is an intricate collection of metaphors which is trying to tell us certain things. And even as we certainly ought to apply that to the Secret Doctrine, so I also suggest that we apply to the systematizations which we shall engage in now. So if we wish to identify the constellation now into which the Secret Doctrine as a luminary may be made to fit, then we need to recognize a certain significant circumstance. That pertaining to the two realities and the two traditions that represent these two realities. This idea, incidentally, not in the precise form in which I am about to present it, but in overall terms, is one that has emerged with increasing force over the last few decades in the study of comparative religion primarily, and one of its chief advocates, if not exactly originators, is in fact our fellow theosophist Professor Robert Elwood of the University of Southern California. Robert Elwood came to advocate some years ago the term and the concept of an alternative reality. And this term has become now fairly well accepted in numerous academic circles and pieces of literature. So in order to understand that, we need to postulate a parallel and frequently complementary, although occasionally also conflictually related, parallel system of two streams of tradition which view and treat reality in different ways. The likelihood concerning the historical origins of these two traditions, but this is of course all very hypothetical, is that the earlier of the two approaches to realities was the one which now we may call the alternative reality. At that time it was the only one, and then later on it became an alternative, and that it probably goes back to the earliest period of culture, which is the Paleolithic age. The Paleolithic age, which is described as the age of the hunter, and in the later period the age of of animal husbandry and so forth. It is that age to which our late and great friend Mr. Joseph Campbell devoted his great volume, The Way of the Animal Powers, which incidentally will shortly be followed by a now posthumous work, The Way of the Seeded Plant, that dealing with the Neolithic age when the agricultural lifestyle begins to enter and ultimately to dominate. Anyway, the spirituality that was practiced and that was, or it is assumed to have been normative in the Paleolithic age, was one within which the principal keynote is one of movement, spiritual mobility, a constant view toward life and reality as a process rather than as a fixed commodity. It is the spiritual analog of the lifetime of the nomad and the hunter who, in order to obtain the means of his livelihood, has to be on the move. And so in this reality, the human being is much more affinitized to life and reality as a moving, changing, transforming process. While when when history changed and the kind of localizing and stabilizing of the external forms of and lifestyles of humanity obtains, then the spiritual orientation begins to change also, and there comes about a spirituality that has become and still is, even in our time, the majority position, the consensus reality, which is represented primarily by the mainstream institutional spirituality really the world over. Even as that historical period within which this originated has to do with fixed residence and agriculture, the enlargement of the clan into a tribe and a nation, which incidentally is always then regarded as unique and acting singularly in history. So the spiritual keynote becomes the keynote of stability and of the stabilizing and utilizing of the forces of being for definite, specific, stable ends. Eventually, in this orientation and in this outlook on life, what originally was a sort of overall and perhaps benign dominion over the environment and over nature changes from dominion to domination. And that is pretty much the phase in which we find ourselves, which of course goes too far. In the stabilizing influence we have the keynote of spirituality or religion being reassurance, meaning and stability. God is in heaven and all is well with the world, in whichever way that might be expressed. Or as our late fellow theosophist and scholar Professor Ernest Wood was wont to say, this is the case of the sparrow doctrine. And he got that expression from a certain statement attributed to Jesus Christ in the Bible, wherein Jesus says that not even a sparrow falls from the roof without the knowledge, the consent, the plan. He didn't use those words, I don't believe, of the Father, which of course means don't worry. There is a rhyme and a reason and an order and a purpose and a plan to everything, and even though things might look pretty rough and disturbing and chaotic, essentially things are still well. This kind of reassuring propping up of the human psyche is one of the principal keynotes, therefore, of this consensus reality and the spirituality that in all likelihood arose out of the Neolithic age. Now, beginning with the Neolithic age, that consensus reality remained dominant up to our present time with certain modifications. But we must remember that an earlier phase of development and powers developed at an earlier time are never truly lost. They may go in part underground, they may become unconscious or preconscious in nature in terms of psychology, but they are there. The child is father to the man, as the Old Testament says. And so the earlier approach to spirituality continues, but it now becomes the alternative reality. And it remains as a complementary, balancing and inspiring factor, nourishing from below the ground of consciousness, as it were, the culture of the consensus reality. By way of a simile, it may be likened to an underground stream, an underground body of water that you can see or detect from the surface of the earth, but which with its life-giving substance nourishes the growth that subsists on the surface. It's an underground irrigation system of the culture. Now, on the board here I have tabulated sort of certain keynotes that would characterize these two spiritual orientations. On this side we have what now would be called the alternative reality. On the other side we have the consensus reality. So we see that the consensus reality tries to stabilize reality into definite forms, while the alternative reality strives at a wonder at reality. The sense of wonder, amazement, and mystery concerning all that is, concerning being, the wonder at the mysteries of being. From that, right there, we can see that practically all forms of mystical endeavor in the known history of cultures that we know of fit obviously into the so-called alternative reality. To the mainstream reality, that mystical wonder, that ecstatic amazement is always a cause of suspicion. Look at the lives of the great mystics in Christendom. Certainly the ancient churches like the Roman Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches have produced many mystics, but all of them had their troubles with the establishment. They weren't just picked up and said, oh, you are going to make a wonderful saint, so come on, we'll give you a real good position. Far from it. Saint John of the Cross, San Juan de la Cruz, one of the greatest mystics, now greatly revered with the Pope, by the Pope and so forth. When he died, he was about to be exiled to Mexico, which was the Spanish Siberia, for rather good reason. I would say. Saint Joan of Arc was first burnt at the stake, and later on she was made a saint. So in that she kind of got the double treatment. First she experienced the flames, and later on the halo and the radiance of heaven and so forth. The mystic is always a thorn in the side of the societal spiritual establishment, because it doesn't quite fit. He's like a wandering shaman in a fixed, stable agricultural society. I've been confronted with people like that in my childhood, because in my native country there were a considerable number of gypsies. And these people were really from another age and from another era. You couldn't get the gypsies to settle. They were moving around. They were in their wagons, most of them. And eventually the Hungarian peasantry came to sort of an agreement with them. They felt that they belonged to reality, just like, I don't know, the gophers and the locusts belong to reality, and one has to get along with them. And if you don't want them to steal you blind, then you give them things when they come around, and that way they were all right. We had a good living arrangement with them. We did not try to force them into our lifestyle, and consequently they helped us out with various things that they could do, primarily playing music and all that sort of thing. But generally a spiritual gypsy, which is what the mystic generally is a cause of annoyance and a puzzlement to the established spirituality, because the established spirituality, in spite of its occasional protestations to the contrary, really wants the individual psyche to adjust to the world. So its principal thrust is adjustment. And it's not always called religion. Sometimes it is called psychology. Look at the psychology of dear Uncle Sigmund Freud with his lovely smelly cigars and all that. His principal thrust was also adjustment. Adjustment to the external reality constitutes mental health and sanity. So he carried very much that consensus reality into psychology. While the alternative reality is not concerned with adjusting to the world, but rather, my favorite way of phrasing it from a sort of Gnostic point of view would be to overcome the world. If you go with Emily Selland's favorite old boys, Plotinus and Iamblichus and Proclus and people like that, they would probably phrase it to mystically become one with the cosmos, which sounds like two exactly opposite statements, but when you penetrate their depths, it comes down pretty much to the same thing. There are various ways of overcoming, but certainly none of the more mystical approaches have to do with adjustment. Similarly, we might say in the consensus reality you conform. In the alternative reality, you are concerned with constant transformation. As we will see later on, when I'll show you another diagram in the latter portion of the discussion, the mainstream tradition always eventually devolves, almost always, into two great aspects. They are like the two pillars that hold up the temple of popular religiosity, and they are the structure of belief on the one hand and the structure of commandment, or religiously motivated popular morality on the other. That's always all that's important. What do you believe, and what kind of a code of behavior you adhere to? While contrasted with that, the alternative reality is concerned with, I couldn't write all that on the blackboard, but I would call it an initiatory essential change of self. Change of self. It is always recognized that essential change of self does not occur as a rule in a flash, but that there is a procedure whereby one works for this. But it is certainly very different from merely working with beliefs and a system of morality. Another way of looking at the reality image of the two is, which I think is fairly accurate and helpful, that in the consensus reality you almost inevitably are confronted, at least by implication, if not by direct statement, with a reality image that is very static. And I call it a prefabricated reality. In other words, look, the world is created, it's fixed, it's done. You are born into this world into a set of fixed conditions. So make the best of it, adhere to the commandments that God gave you, believe in the right things, and maybe then you will get out of it without having to enjoy a climate in the hereafter that will be even warmer than last weekend was in Illinois, you know. But on the other hand, once again, the alternative reality, however, sees reality not as a fixed situation, but something that is subject to transformation and movement. It is going. It is moving, and moreover it is going somewhere. It is going to a glorious denouement, a great destiny which perhaps we are not able to describe. How could we, since we aren't there yet? But we have all kinds of intimations that it's something very great and very wonderful and very good. Now, I would suggest for the consideration of secret doctrine students and so forth, that it is somewhere in this area, in the area of the transforming reality, that we have to locate, for instance, the strong emphasis in the secret doctrine and in HPB's teachings in general of her version, her particular modified expression of the teaching of evolution. I very strongly feel that what HPB truly means by evolution is the image of the transforming reality, not a fixed situation. See that, and certainly the bombshell that probably made her proclamation of a not merely physical but a spiritual and psychological, Elaine Pagels just kind of coined the term in her latest book, psychoneumatic, which means both psychic and spiritual, differentiating psyche and spirit. So it's a soul spirit transformation and development, and in this case evolution, that HPB was able to come forth with a psychoneumatic evolutionary concept was of course facilitated by the bombshell that came first, which was the discovery of biological, physical evolution on the part of Darwin. So HPB did not, I feel, try to hitch her wagon to biological evolution. Once again, she used that as a contemporary metaphoric device to call attention to the image of a transforming reality. Once again, I feel that just replacing one set of intellectual, physical teachings and principles with another is not really what the alternative reality is trying to do. From the point of view of the alternative reality, you are not particularly better off if you have converted from Southern Baptism to, oh, heaven forbid, Theosophy. If that conversion was merely an exchange of intellectual beliefs and principles, of one set of principles for another. But if you were able to shift reality gears, as it were, if you were able to jump over from the consensus reality into this one, into the alternative reality, then you have at least created the possibility of an essential personal change. Now, of course, in order to go along with this, you more or less have to accept the proposition, which I thoroughly accept, that mere intellectual belief does not transform, does not change. It may introduce certain modifications at the level of the personality which may be needed, but it does not produce what Mircea Eliade was wont to call essential change, the change of essence that goes all the way through. And that is really what this reality is after. And then just as a little afterthought, the representatives, at least at the more developed, more sophisticated periods of these two traditions, on the one hand would be yesterday morning I wrote down priest, and then I didn't want to insult priests that much, you know. I particularly don't like to insult myself. I have been known to do it to others. It's less painful than when you do it to yourself. Then you can always depend on them to do it back to you, and everything, you created a little exercise in karma. But let's say, so I put down minister. I mean, why not knock the Protestants a little bit? They are so knockable. But in any event, whatever you would call it, what I'm sort of referring to is the typical religious person, the man of the cloth in the community, who is a pillar of the secular society, although he represents spiritual things. The spiritual aspect having not only been integrated into, but really having become subservient to secular ends. That kind of a religious person. But the representative of the alternative reality tradition is, and it's better to use the Latin word magus, because if you say magician, then it immediately magician conjures up visions of someone with a top hat who pulls rabbits out of the hat and so forth. So that's the sort of thing that one could do easily on Camp Indralaya on Orcas Island, because of the usually extreme prevalence and proliferation of rabbits. If you ever come there, you will see that it's a matter of astonishment. Several times when I was there, I had a larger audience of rabbits than humans, even though the human, and you know, they are very attentive, the ears are always up. You know, that's the kind of rabbit magic, sleight of hand magic type of thing. But the magus is really the figure of the representative, as it were, of the alternative reality tradition as it developed after a certain historical period. Now, all of this long rumination of the theory of the history of religion is presented here for the purpose of suggesting that HPB's secret doctrine is indeed neither more nor less than a monument to and the documentation of the alternative reality tradition, geared, however, in many ways, at least in its literary form and in terms of many of its arguments, to the intellectual and spiritual climate of the late 19th century. So, in the late 19th century, a grand presentation of the alternative reality tradition was made, in large part geared to the level of receptivity and the expectations of people at that time, but certainly not entirely so. That is the kind of document that we are dealing with. So we are not just dealing with a one-time, once and for all revelation, but we are dealing with a document which is an integral part of a revelatory and transformative process, originating in a revelatory and transformative intent, somewhere in the deepest heart of the mystery of being. You see, one of the difficulties I think that we experience, especially in this country, when dealing with the various aspects of the alternative reality tradition, is that psychologically we have been conditioned for such a long time, and with such vengeance by the consensus reality tradition, that when elements of this side begin to appear, we judge them and evaluate them and try to understand them in those terms over there. Just like years ago, a very dear old lady whom some of you may have known, perhaps Joy has also, the late Professor Judith Tyberg. I remember I hope I'm not stepping on anyone's toes, although I really don't hope that I don't, you know. I mean, let's be honest for a change, you know. So anyway, whatever the toes will do in response to this, but I can always blame it on Judith Teiberg since she's no longer here, physically at least. So I remember when the publicity about Satya Sai Baba began to come out. And we had a meeting with Professor Teiberg, who lived for a long time in India, and she was a personal disciple of Sri Aurobindo and all that sort of thing. And we asked her, well, what about this business of, you know, this is supposed to be the avatar and everything? Well, he says, you know, she says that the people don't understand here really what that means within an Indian context. She says at any given time, there are at least 8 to 10, if not more, people around in India who are generally regarded as avatars, downright incarnations of the deity, pure and simple. And people don't get terribly excited about that. For they go and for a few weeks or months they go and sit at the feet of one avatar, and then, well, let's see about the other avatar in the other province or so, you know. They have, since it's part of their culture, they have a certain sense of proportion about this. But you see, Judith Teiberg said, in the West, we only had one avatar, and that was Jesus Christ. And so whenever these concepts came up, we judged them in terms of our own culture. This is it, the one and only, the soul for past, present, and future, because we have the monotheistic, single-minded, concentrated view of these things. We don't have a multi-centered God image. And so we are forever translating some of these impressions that come to us from one other reality in terms of this one. And in so doing, we make not just a leap of faith, but we make a leap into the abyss of error and difficulty very frequently. Now that's also the kind of thing that we face here. And so we look upon, I don't say we, no one in this room, I'm sure, would do such thing. But people can look at a document such as the Secret Doctrine as a unique revelation, like the unique revelation of the New Testament or of the Quran. There never was one before, there never will be one again. This is it. And not see it as part of a process. We are evaluating it in consensus reality terms as a unique one-time event. I don't want to go now into the concept of time, but that has a great deal to do with it too, because the notion of historical time, which consists of a series of unique events, each one quite unique in itself, is also a part of the development that comes out of the Neolithic era. And so earlier that doesn't exist. And that's for in the consensus reality you have all those unique events, but in the alternative reality, we, at least to some extent and degree, everything exists, as they used to call it in Latin, sub specie aeternitatis, under the species, under the category of eternity. In mythical time, once upon a time, as the fairy tales have it, or in illo tempore, in those days, as the New Testament always has it, and so on and so forth. The Australian aboriginals, don't call them aborigines, because that's a put-down term, I'm told, you see. The Australian aboriginals call it the dream time. It's another dimension, another way of dealing with things. So now, I suggest, therefore, as the initial thesis, that the Secret Doctrine, and therefore, of course, the entire Theosophical tradition, because after better than 100 years, I think we have a right to be called a tradition. Why not? And you have these persnickety, snooty sort of people, the traditionalists of one kind or the other, and particularly the ones who are attached to the late figure of a French writer by the name of René Guénon. They are around nowadays in various people, and they sneer at everything that they don't like, at everybody outside of their own ranks, because they don't belong to a valid tradition. And I said to people like that on frequent occasion about Theosophy, which they are particularly down on, said, well, look, how long does it take to become a tradition? If 120 years or so is not enough to be considered even an incipient tradition, does it take 500? Does it take 5,000? What makes a tradition? We are a tradition too by now. And so I think our entire tradition belongs to the alternative reality. That is how it must be considered. If indeed, even to some extent and degree, we can accept that proposition, then it is perfectly obvious that the issue of magic and occultism, at least as I understand it, plays a very prominent role in this tradition and must also, when properly understood, be accepted as playing a very prominent role in the Theosophical tradition itself. Now, having more or less done with that now, we need to go on again a little further and see how magical and how occult in the true sense, or in the sense in which I would like to use those words, the secret doctrine really is. There is a secret in the secret doctrine. Well, probably more than one, but the the one that I am particularly capitalizing on now is that, just like in a dream, in depth psychological view, there is a manifest content, which is what you actually dreamt, the imagery. But then there is the hidden content, which is the meaning that you have to figure out, that does not appear on the surface. So the secret doctrine has a secret. The occult is, the one thing about the occult is that it is occult. It has something hidden. The occult is not all this channeling and all these phenomena, because what's occult about them? They are right out in the open, you know. They are totally manifest. These channelers let it all hang out, as it were. And often one wishes that they would exercise a greater degree of restraint and modesty. There are some things that should be displayed and others better remain occult. Now I'm doing the other thing. I'm laughing at my own occult joke, which you can't share because I haven't told you. But in any event, there is a secret in the secret doctrine. There is something occult in the occult, and that is that even though it might appear that a book like the Secret Doctrine is the same kind of a book like many others, it tries to share information and maybe a little bit of inspiration along with it, that is not really the case. And to compare the Secret Doctrine to the overwhelming majority of other books, even of a philosophical, even of a metaphysical, even of an occult nature, is like comparing apples and oranges. The reason for it being that, at least I feel, that the Secret Doctrine is not so much just trying to inform you and give you data and information. The Secret Doctrine is trying to change you. It is not not primarily, I don't say that there is an aspect of it, it is not primarily an instrumentality of communication and information, but it is a modality of transformation for the reader and for the student, if the reading and the study is undertaken with the proper openness and a correct intent. That is axiomatic if we accept the notion that the Secret Doctrine squarely fits within the alternative reality tradition, because within this tradition anyone hardly ever does anything just to communicate facts, or even just to communicate ideas and ideals. But such communication or alternative modalities are practiced for the principal purpose of inducing and facilitating and accomplishing essential change within the individual. Just to kind of show you that I am not the only weirdo to hold that kind of a view, I'll come back again to the gentleman whom I mentioned earlier on, Robert Elwood, who in his book Religious and Spiritual Groups in Modern America, which was published in the early 70s, originally before Robert joined the society, by the way, although he was already very interested and so forth. There he wrote about a wide spectrum of the alternative reality tradition and its manifestation at that time in our culture, and he also wrote about Theosophy, about the Secret Doctrine. Here is a little quotation concerning his view of the Secret Doctrine, and this is what he said: "The Secret Doctrine is a book not easily forgotten. To understand what it has to offer, one must learn how to read it. The Secret Doctrine is not a textbook, but it is like an ocean with waves and currents and eddies and whirlpools and quiet caves. It calls for suspending one's normal mode of conceptual progress until one has discovered where the tides and techniques of this new medium will carry him." Then Elwood goes on to say, "Water is to man a distorting element, and probably whatever he sees in it will not be seen as it really, whereby he means physically, is. The ecstatic surges in his body as he rides the swells will not be forgotten after he has found his feet once again on the sand. Like riding the waves or like listening to great music, this book takes one to where one can perceive reality in new configurations that unite the subjective and the objective." To see reality in a new unitive perspective, to perceive reality in new configurations that unite the subjective and the objective. And then he goes on to say, which I think is probably the most specific of his statements here, "It does not so much convey specific fact as arrange science, myth, philosophy, and poetic narrative in peculiar combinations which can generate remarkable experiences, or so it has been with Theosophists." And further he writes, "As one goes into the world of the Secret Doctrine, one understands more and more that it presents a psychological model of the cosmos. The more its vision is comprehended and interiorized, the more the reader shares the workings of universal consciousness."